Okay.
And if I knew this was going to happen, I might have even tried to see if we could figure it out in person when I was there just the other day. What neighborhood are you in?
I'm in Hollywood.
Yeah, so I was in North Hollywood yesterday and the day before.
Oh,
I was staying with a friend. Well, this is delightful. I mean, what a treat, I have to say. I'm talking to the filmmaker Christopher Munch, and I started getting into film in, I'd say, the mid to late 80s. Like, I say this all the time on the podcast, Christopher, but my parents were really into film, and they introduced me to Bergman and Kurosawa and Fellini. Those were their go-to guys, you know. So I grew up watching art films as well as going to E.T. and those type of Hollywood movies. But when I first started discovering film as a young adult, they were the films of Jim Jarmusch and Spike Lee, Steven Soderbergh, right, and Susan Seidelman, and I don't know, just all these filmmakers that were making these downtown hip films, and that's who I discovered. And amidst that period of time, or a couple of years later, was this weird one-off, 1 hour long film, which I kept reading about and hearing about, called The Hours and Times. And of course, I was always a huge John Lennon fan and Beatles fan too, and so I naturally was going to see it. But I remember specifically that it had a buzz to it, that it was getting a lot of positive critical attention, your film. And that was in 1992.
Yeah, I mean, it was really fortunate that it had some supporters in the media who took every opportunity to kind of champion it.
Well, we have an opportunity to talk about it again. It's kind of coming around again to people's attention because there's been a 4K restoration of the film, and Oscilloscope is redistributing it. It's got a lot of a pedigree, dare I say, behind this re-release of the film, which is very exciting. But let's go back to the origin story a little bit, because I'm so curious about that. First of all, the film itself, and then I want to talk about like how it did get attention, how you got it out there in the world, because it's kind of this odd 1 hour length, you know, and it's black and white, all this stuff, you know, and the story itself, of course.
There was a moment, I think, that spanned the period of around 1991 until 93 or 4, maybe.
Okay.
But it sort of fell in the middle of that.
In fact,
Ruby Rich, I think, was one of the people who first wrote about it as a group of films, and she did an article in the Village Voice, which I think came out in around 92. So my picture came out in 92. And then in 91, there were a couple of really fine movies, Todd Haynes' Poison, and Gus Van Zant's My Own Private Idaho.
Sure.
And those, I think, maybe are seen as the beginning of that era. And then it went on for a while, and the whole, you know, subject of gay-themed films became a whole other thing where the market, I think, for it sort of grew, and there were more outlets to target that specialized market, really. So the films oftentimes, I don't think, had to be distributable to a larger audience necessarily.
Talking just also before even going back further, you wrote this. When did this idea? When did it germinate? And were you like a big music fan, or was this like some sort of arbitrary article you read? How did you come up with the idea of making this into a story and fleshing it out, since we don't know that it actually occurred or not?
Exactly. I mean, looking back now, I really can't pinpoint how I first sort of became aware of this mythology surrounding Brian Epstein and John Lennon, and the possibility that, you know, there had been a kind of intimate liaison in Spain. Several Beatles biographers had written about it. I think Philip Norman, you know, had first talked about it in Shout, which was not one of the earliest Beatles biographies, but it was regarded as one of the best in the early 80s. And then Peter Brown as well wrote that wonderful kind of novelistic book called The Love You Make, and he wrote about it. And then after that, there were some more sensational accounts. Albert Goldman, who was known as, I think, a more sensational biographer, also wrote about it. So somehow it was in my awareness. And in late 1987, I sort of just sat down and wrote the script. I mean, prior to that, I had spent the better part of my time since I finished high school, really, in 1980, working on two rather abortive feature projects that never saw the light of day, although I did shoot them. The first one I never completed the editing of, and the second one I completed the editing of, but it was one of those things that fell in an in-between world where it wasn't strong enough commercially just to be promoted as a genre film or a strictly commercial thing, but it also didn't really have any redeeming artistic qualities to find art house distribution. So I do regard The Hours and Times as my first professional effort, and it was the first one that was seen publicly. And as I say, I wrote it in late 87, and I wound up shooting it in the spring of 88. And I had a small legacy from a relative who had died, and I knew that I had maybe $15,000 or $20,000 with which to make a movie, and what could I do with that, basically? So it was conceived at the outset to be this very contained chamber piece, and of course I was, like a lot of people, a big fan of sort of the late Bergman chamber pieces of the 70s, and which were very intricate and very very nuanced, but on
you pay homage to it. You pay homage to that in your film, The Hours in Time, and considering how brief the running time is, I was pretty impressed with that.
To one of the earlier films, sure, yeah, to one
Silence.
of his great movies, of course. But it seemed like something that I could manage to do, and I had spent a lot of time trying to fund movies sort of in the way that one hears you go about that. I had placed an ad, a display ad in Daily Variety, probably at the risk of winding up in jail, looking for investors for a film limited partnership, and that didn't really lead anywhere. So I figured it was better to try something on a real shoestring that was simple enough, at least on a production level, where I had a chance of realizing it. So I had been living in California, but went to England and stayed there for the better part of a year. And casting, the role of Lennon was the hardest. David Angus, who played the role of Epstein, came into my sphere of awareness pretty early. I had placed an ad in not Backstage, but whatever the comparable London theater paper is, looking for an actor. I'd rented a room in a film school and had met with a few people, and he seemed like a wonderful, classically trained actor who could do anything. Finding Lennon was a bit harder. I met a number of up-and-coming, very talented actors, but nobody really wanted to do it.
May I ask if any of those auditioned ended up being names that we know? Because there's just that period seems to have spawned so many great British actors. Well, they've always been fantastic British actors, but that generation in particular.
It's true. I think the concern was that because Lennon was so strongly identified with Liverpool and the particular cadence of a Liverpudlian, that was intimidating even for a very capable English actor. But before too long, there was a casting director in Liverpool who was casting a soap opera there called Brookside. And I called her up and rang her up, and she was very kind and said, "Well, have you met Ian Hart?" And I said, "No, I never had." And he, as it turns out, was in California at that point, so I wouldn't have been able to meet him. And I was preparing to come back to California and try and make something here. But
were you living? You were based in California typically.
I was, yeah.
Okay,
yeah, and. So Ian got back to London just about the right time, and as soon as I met him, even though he really looked nothing like John Lennon, he had absolutely all of the qualities and the capability that was necessary to play that role. So at that point, we just decided to do it, and we went to Spain. I had been there sort of looking for a place to do it, and nothing was really pinned down on a production level. There was no arranger or anything like that. So they stayed...
Arranger?
They sort of... An arranger,
like a do you mean like an
advanced person?
Yeah, like a fixer or
a fixer. Yeah.
Sorry,
gotcha. That's the word I was thinking of.
No, I was just, maybe you keep using British, versions of the like you did. I rang her up. You said earlier instead of call her up.
So We went down. We checked into the Hotel Avenida Palace, which was one of the grand old hotels of Barcelona. Many of the jet set had stayed there in the swinging '60s, including the Beatles and Brian Epstein. And we had rehearsed the script ahead of time in London, so the actors were very well prepared. And there was a fellow who worked for the camera hire company named Juan Carlos Valls, who came and helped us, and he was our only crew, really. So it was just us, and then the supporting actors flew down on the days when they worked, and that was how we made the picture. We shot, I think, for 4 days in Spain, and then a couple of more days in London, finishing off the airplane and a few other shots that we didn't get in Spain.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Ian Hart, like he looked nothing like Lennon, but by the end of the movie, you're completely convinced it's the performance. It's astounding. It's so great.
He's an amazing actor, yeah, and one of my dearest friends as well. And in fact, he just played a pivotal role in the new picture that I'm finishing called The 11th Green. And he wasn't playing a rock star, but he played, in contrast to that, the Cold Warrior James Forrestal, who was the first Secretary of Defense and who died kind of tragically in 1949. So Ian came over and did that for me, and I was thrilled that actually marked almost to the day the 30th anniversary of our having first worked together.
At the beginning I started talking about the hours and times and how positive the response was to it, critically and otherwise. And I mean, one of the main things you would constantly read is his performance, his name. And from there ever after, I would always notice him in whatever I saw. I just can't remember him in anything before. Did you... I mean, it sounded like he was relatively unknown in terms of the film world in the United States, anyway. Is that the case?
And in England as well. He had been in an ensemble film for Channel 4 in Britain, whose title I forget. But apart from that, he hadn't really had a lot of exposure. He did get hired after my film to play Lennon again in the film Backbeat. Wow.
Yeah. So I guess you can take credit for discovering Ian Hart. Okay, let me cross that off. You discovered him. Brian Epstein, which of the fifth Beatles was he? There's like 6 or 7 fifth Beatles, right? He was definitely one of the first fifth Beatles.
Yes, I think so. I mean, certainly Stu Sutcliffe was referred to that, the other member of the band. But
That's
Brian
right.
Epstein, was a really beloved figure and of course was responsible for shepherding their rise in the world.
Yeah, and they just, you depict in the story, again, I guess for those few who may not be familiar with the story, we referred to earlier, this is a kind of a bit of a vacation weekend, a long weekend. So with the idea that John Lennon needs some rest because they're performing ceaselessly at this stage, and the idea is Brian and John went off. They were close, and they stayed in Barcelona, and that's all we know. Where you came in is with there were some rumors that perhaps the relationship was deeper. And so this is what that story might have looked like. And it's so true. What more could you have... This just seemed like so authentic and emotionally honest a story. Your writing was so sensitive, and the performances were so sensitive. It was very moving. And I'm so grateful that the film was able to come into my purview again, because it's been literally going on 30 years soon, and I was really grateful to see it again. It sort of brought me back to that place that I saw it. It made me uneasy, maybe because of the subject matter and my age when I originally saw it, and as now a much more, mature person, I just thought, their relationship, their friendship was just beautifully portrayed. Did you get a lot of people pushing back, fans and whatnot? Because in 92 wasn't that long after the Beatles. It's much closer to that time.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think most of the feedback that I received, or nearly all of the feedback I received, was not that. It was positive, and it was interesting the way in which I think the audience appropriated the film on some personal level and related it to events that may have happened in their own lives, separate and apart from whatever nostalgia or whatever affection they had for the Beatles or Brian Epstein. So it's been very interesting for me to observe the response to the film. As the maker of it, I wish now, in hindsight, I could have done a better job with the movie. I wish in some way I had been able to mount a more comprehensive, biography of Epstein, who was truly a fascinating figure. And as far as I know, there hasn't been a dramatic film about him specifically mounted yet, although many people have tried to do so. And there have been a number of projects over the years that have almost come to fruition. And I'm not sure, if there is one happening now or not, but there have been one or two very excellent documentaries about Epstein. But as a filmmaker, seeing this small glimpse into two much bigger lives that had many twists and turns, two remarkable people who did a lot in their years, even though Epstein died as fairly early. He died in 1967. There was a lot crammed into those few years that he was involved with the Beatles. So in hindsight, again, I am sometimes uneasy about being associated with this film more than some of my later work, which I feel is stronger. But I've also, very much appreciated the fact that it has been meaningful for the audience, and I'm very appreciative of the fact that the Sundance Institute and Oscilloscope Labs have put out this new edition of it, because there was not a good edition of the film available in the U.S. or anywhere really. So this really fills that gap, and because I, as a filmmaker of the sort that I am, I mean, there was never really any money to properly create these archival elements. So it's very much appreciated that they came along and did that with the UCLA Film Archive.
I just wanted to just end up saying you referenced that Brian Epstein died in 1967. It was a result of a drug overdose. Was it, I guess, confirmed that it was a suicide, an intentional?
I think it was. I think it was identified as being an incautious use of drugs and alcohol. He took a lot of uppers and downers, but I don't think he necessarily set out to kill himself consciously, other than through the incautious use of.
There's obviously some self-destructive behavior going on, but doesn't necessarily mean he was suicidal. I get it. Yeah. Right, I understand. Speaking of the restoration, you've already mentioned the various folks that were involved, including Sundance and UCLA Film and Television Archive, which is wonderful. Who came to whom about this? Sounds like they approached you. Is that what happened?
Yeah, apparently, the Sundance Institute has a very worthwhile program of preserving many of the titles that have played at the festival and that were of such a nature where they wouldn't otherwise be preserved. So in that sense, they're doing a really wonderful thing, and not all of them get re-released or shown at the festival, but they've partnered with the UCLA Film and Television Archive to do that. So John Nine at the Sundance Institute was in touch with me about it, and apparently from what he told me, they had been considering it for a while, and then finally, went ahead and did it.
This will be at the Quad Cinema starting, at least in New York City. We'll have a theatrical run almost 30 years later. Starting March 1st here in New York City. I hope that people show up at the Quad in some numbers, certainly for the weekend anyway, for Q&As. Is it going to be in L.A.? Is it going to play it?
I think they're looking for a play date in L.A.
Okay.
Los Angeles is really a difficult city for the type of movies that I make. But
understood. Well, anyway, I'm sure it'll be more broadly available online again there'll probably be a big push again where
Absolutely,
you'll be able to see this.
It was never available on VOD as far as I know in the U.S. So that'll be a really nice thing for someone who happens to be interested in it to be able to access it either that way or on a physical disc.
Right. Congratulations on that. And while you may be more proud of your subsequent films, I can only say that for a generation of film lovers and cinephiles who may have be roughly our age, maybe I'm a little older even, I'm not sure, but
Sounds like we're similar in age.
yeah. That film, it's the timing sometimes of it. When a film happens to enter into the world, that can sometimes be as meaningful as the quality from a technical or whatever your litmus is for what makes a great film. It stands up. I watched it again last night and was very moved. So,
thank you.
So hopefully we can do this again on this next film you're talking about, which it sounds like Ian is in.
Yes, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, that'd be great. So thanks for making this work.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Adam.
Okay.